cool. So, it's going to be back here. Yes, I'm going to talk about new theories of learning. These are three of them. One is rapid learning. Like let's say you get into the subject at school for the first time, you have to learn a little bit, you need to put things on, so you can close your eyes and ask questions about, this is what's to my right, this is what's to my left, and so on. And you can do that in light exposure, which is pretty remarkable. Creativity, this is an example of the science side of it, creating novel images. Reasoning, which reaches its hypotheses and these are remarkable capabilities, and what's exciting is that we can see some of these capabilities in animals, but also reproduce, especially creativity and reasoning machines. And we'd like to understand how this works and how to improve it. With this respect of rapid learning in mice, mice can also navigate in a and we can actually get at the real underpinnings of neural networks. The social models, for example, the AI dialogue, can also create new images that are quite different from the written translation. And how do we do that? The model images the pictures, draws, visualizes, monitors, and so forth. So how does this work? We now have AI systems that are not just LLMs, but they work with proof assistants and so forth to do really, really well. For example, the International Math Olympiad. So that's kind of the outline for the talk. Everything I'm going to talk about is actually recently published in archives, and these are the relevant papers. Okay, so let's start with rapid learning and navigation. So animals can navigate to novel environments within seconds. So here's an example, if you could play the video. Here's an example of a mice in a virtual reality environment in a trackball. So the mouse you can see is running, the trackball moves, and the video moves at a speed and proportional to the mouse's motion on the trackball. Right? So this is a virtual reality environment that has several prominent towers or landmarks. So the mouse can figure out where it is, partially based on its representations in the medial entorhinal cortex, which contains these famous grid cells. These are cells that fire if and only if the mouse is at the vertices of hexagonal grid in a square environment. We record from these same cells in the 1D virtual track, and as you'll see, they show periodic firing patterns. So we want to understand how these grid cell representations respond to this virtual reality environment as you change the environment. And this is work done by Ben Sorsher, who I sent to you guys to be a postdoc here. I think he's joining soon. And then John Wen in Lisa Giacomo's lab, and Lisa Giacomo was a very close collaborator of mine at Stanford. Okay. So the questions we're going to ask is, let's say there's no environment. What is the structure of the grid code in the dark? What is kind of the tabula rasa of the grid code before it enters a new environment? Second, how do visual landmarks affect the grid cell code? And third, few-shot learning. If you change the environment slightly, how does it incorporate it immediately? Okay, and again, all the details are in this paper. Okay, so this is what the grid cells look like in the dark. Here are two grid cells in the two panels. The vertical axis is trial index, as it's sort of going through the track in the dark. And each row is a raster of spiking. And as you can see, the spiking is quite disordered, right? There doesn't seem to be very much structure in these grid cells in the dark. Okay? But if you do a Fourier transform of the activity of these grid cells, you'll see three characteristic peaks. Okay? If they all come from the same grid cell module that shares the same spatial structure. And if you actually look at the phases of the peaks of these histograms, you have three phases corresponding to three peaks, but it turns out they obey a linear relationship. And so you can characterize each cell by two of the phases. So then what you can do is you can place each cell on a torus. Sorry. I'm trying to avoid using the pointer because of the Zoom group. Okay, so let's see. So So yeah, so you can take each cell, take its two phases and put it on the two-dimensional torus of phases. So one cell gets placed here, another cell gets placed here, and you can visualize the neural activity as a function on this torus of all the cells, and this is what it looks like. It turns out there's theoretical reasons why it should look like this, and that's what motivated us to do this, but don't worry about this particular analysis. The entire point I want you to take from this slide is you can take these hundreds of cells that we record from entorhinal cortex, and we can plot their activity as a heat map on this two-dimensional torus, and you can see that it retains a sort of bump of activity that translates as the mouse moves along the virtual track. And so this is the instantaneous moment-by-moment attractor state of the neural network, and it's moving this fashion, so we can do a dramatic dimensionality reduction of the neural activity to just two numbers, which is the position of the peak of the bump. Okay, so now we've extracted a two-dimensional dynamical system from the brain. Okay, you can think of it as the attractor state of the network. Okay, so now how does this attractor state evolve? Okay, in the absence of landmarks, this bump trajectory actually drifts and accumulates error. Right, so for example, on the first lap, it might take one trajectory. On the 100th lap, it might take another trajectory. And we can unroll this torus and sort of look at its covering space, right? So this is sort of one lattice of the torus, and you can look at this bump trajectory as the animal moves in the dark, and it's sort of straight for a while, but then it starts drifting, okay? By the way, there's multiple modules corresponding to different spatial scales, and their drift is coupled to each other, suggesting the two modules are talking to each other. It turns out the transport is diffusive. There's a diffusive drift, angular drift of about 3.5 degrees squared per meter. So this is a very rapid angular decoherence of the trajectory in the absence of landmarks to correct it. Okay? So that's what the system does in the dark. Okay, now how do landmarks affect the grid cell code? Right? So we all know that as we move, we have two sorts of information to figure out where we are. Integration of velocity, and that's what you just saw, but also landmarks can correct where we are. Okay, so now what we do is we start introducing those towers that you saw, right? We introduce them one by one, right? So, sorry. So we add towers one by one, and then you can suddenly see that each cell suddenly snaps in and phase locks to the periodicity of the track, okay? And in terms of the 2D trajectory, you can see that as you add the towers, the angular drift stabilizes. Okay, so the landmarks are really stabilizing the position of the grid cells. Okay, now you can ask a very basic question. On the very first trial, after you add a new tower, what happens? Okay, you can see that here, right? So these pink trajectories are what you see before you add the next landmark. These blue trajectories are what you see after you add that landmark. And then you can ask, what is the trajectory on the first trial where it's first experiencing the landmark? Well, it's going through the track not knowing that a new landmark is coming up. So that's this one blue curve in the sea of pink curves. But then after that trial, after one experience with the landmark, it snaps into a new trajectory. Okay, that's really remarkable, right? So it's a one-shot change in the representation. Okay. So these visual landmarks distort the bump trajectory in predictable ways. I'm going to skip the details of the slide in the interest of time. Okay, so how do we model this? Okay, how do we model this sort of one-shot learning? Well, we adopt what we call a weak random pinning model. Okay, so basically, we imagine that landmark inputs are coming in as sensory inputs and making synaptic connections onto the grid cell network. And we imagine that the impact of a landmark is to provide some excess excitation to a subset of cells, which effectively points to pinning the bump, the attractor bump, to the location or the pinning location of the landmark. So landmark 1 comes in and pins it, landmark 2 comes in and pins it, and then so the bump trajectory distorts. We see evidence for these distortions. I'll skip the details of that, but how do we model it? So imagine the following very simple two-dimensional dynamical system of how velocity and motion interact. So x of t is the physical location of the mouse on the virtual reality environment as a function of time t. L sub I is the location on the virtual track where the landmark appears. So this is some amplitude function that tells you how close the mouse is to the landmark. Okay? It rises when this argument is 0, and it falls off elsewhere. Phi I is the pinning phase of landmark I, and theta is the location of the attractor bump on this 2D torus. So as the mouse gets to a landmark, the landmark pinning phase pulls the attractor phase towards it, and then it, of course, integrates velocity as well. Okay? It's an extremely simple model. It just has 2 parameters for each landmark. Okay? What's surprising about this model is it's also predictive. So what we can do is we can learn the 2 parameters for each landmark in a random environment setting, where we expose the mouse to 12 different environments. We fit the model to the data using 11 environments. And then we take the held out environment and we ask if our model can predict neural activity in that new environment. This, to my knowledge, has never been done before, which is predicting what neural representations will look like for the first time before a mouse enters an environment. Okay? And we can actually do that. So here's just one example of a cell. So the black raster is a cell in the held out, it cells activity in the held out environment. And this is our prediction. And you can see a qualitative similarity. And you can go further with more examples and look at a quantitative similarity. So this is really the upper right plot is what you want to look at. So not all cells are equally spatially stable. So each cell has a measure of spatial stability, which is how correlated is its neural activity as a function of space on the first half of the experiment with the second half of the experiment. So that's the horizontal axis. This is the predictivity, the correlation coefficient between our model and the data. And as you can see, the cells that are spatially stable are well predicted by our model. Okay. So, okay, and then few-shot learning. It turns out that we can do experiments where we now then suddenly change the location of the landmarks and ask the mouse to stop at a hidden reward location where there might be water. And what we find, I'm going to skip the details of the slide, but what we find is that the grid cells are tethered to the landmarks. You shift the grid cells, you shift the landmarks, right? But behavior is rapidly changes after a few trials. So basically it overshoots the water reward, the hidden water reward, when you shift the landmarks, but a few trials later, it immediately gets it. And that we can model by downstream plasticity on the distorted grid cell representations. And we can get that to work. So I'll skip the details of that. And this task is indeed MEC dependent. Okay, so just to summarize, I think the take-home principles of this part of the talk. How should we fuse 2 disparate sources of information, landmarks and self-motion, to map space? Well, a simple possibility, it's too complicated, so don't incorporate landmarks. But then grid cells would be unstable over time due to noisy integration of velocity. That's the dark results and also some old work with Lisa and Kia Hardcastle, who's at Harvard, showing that you'd get rapid errors. The other possibility is that you could have landmarks strongly pin the grid cell code, but then you'd have to learn the correct pinning location so that you don't induce strong distortions in the grid cell code. And we showed that that could be done over much longer timescales. The pinning locations can be learned. There's evidence that they're learned, and our theory explains how that can be learned through Hebbian plasticity from landmarks to grid cells, and that's in these 2 works. But as soon as you enter an environment for the first time where there isn't enough time for plasticity between landmarks and grid cells, I think the best strategy is a weak, fixed, random landmark pinning model of the type that we posited. The fixed random pinning allows MEC representations of new environments to emerge in a single exposure. The weak pinning stabilizes the grid cells, and it allows only small distortions of the grid cell code. These small distortions of the map from physical space to neural space can easily be fixed via rapid downstream plasticity to correct behavior under environmental changes. Okay, so more details are in this paper. Okay, so I just wanted to advertise one other paper in the same framework, or same kind of setting of rapid navigational learning. This is a paper led by James Whittington, and it's this paper here. So imagine going back to coming out in Harvard Square. We enter a new environment for the first time when we take a single path through it while looking around, okay? Maybe a short path around the vicinity of the subway. Then we can immediately answer many counterfactual questions. You could probably close your eyes and say, what would I see if I looked left, assuming you had looked left at some point in the past? What would I see if I walked a few steps back? What would be on my right, right? This is somewhat remarkable. Like, how do we do this in one shot? Okay, so we came up with a model that does this, and I'll just give you the highlights of the model. So how does a fixed, non-plastic working memory network, perhaps in prefrontal cortex, implement this cognitive map-like capacity? So here are the key ideas. You're walking around and you have some sensory subspace in prefrontal cortex that loads in information. Now, as you take actions, that information in the sensory subspace is rotated to another subspace where the identity of the subspace depends on which action you take. As multiple actions are taken in sequence, information in all the subspaces are rotated, allowing for compositions of actions. So after you've loaded this information up in memory, at some instant of time, you have neural activity in a large collection of subspaces. Each subspace is labeled by a specific composition of actions. For example, one subspace could correspond to, I recently took 2 steps forward, or my last 2 actions where I took 2 steps forward. And then the neural activity in the subspace contains the answer to the counterfactual question associated with the inverse of the subspace's action label, i.e., what would I see if I looked 2 steps back? You look in the subspace corresponding to 2 steps forward, right? So you can make a very biologically plausible model, neural network model that does that. And it actually explains a diversity of data in monkey prefrontal cortex. For example, we see rotating subspaces in work from Tim Bushman's lab at Princeton, and we can explain that work in our model. We see examples of rotating subspaces in the immediate recall of spatial sequences in monkey prefrontal cortex, and also rotating subspaces in immediate recall of odor sequences in monkey prefrontal cortex. So again, all the details are in the paper, but I think this idea of action conditional rotation of sensory information is a great way to load up working memory. It has nice theoretical properties, and it seems to explain some experimental data. Okay, and I just want to also advertise Javon's work, who's going to be presenting a poster here. Another route to rapid learning is transfer from older tasks, right? You know, I used to play varsity tennis at MIT. I think we lost to the Harvard JV team. It's a bitter memory of mine. But you know, maybe that transfers a little bit to ping pong. I can testify that it doesn't quite transfer that well to ping pong. But in any case, when does learning on one task speed up learning on another? Javon gives a very beautiful answer to this in the context of linear regression. And he has very precise relationships between the old task and the new task that are necessary and sufficient for good transfer. So check out his poster here. Okay, so let's move on to creativity. I'm not going to say too much about creativity because Mason, the first author of this work, is going to give a talk tomorrow. But I just wanted to whet your appetite for that. Okay, and this is in this paper that'll be presented at ICML. Okay, so yeah, I mean, we're all kind of surprised by generative AI in terms of how many kind of novel images it can create and so forth. And where does this come from? How are these novel images composed of the training data? Okay, so again, just a quick primer in diffusion models. This is the first diffusion model paper that Joshua did in my lab. It was actually really inspired by ideas from non-equilibrium mechanics, which my group was studying at the time. But the basic idea is you have some data, you noise it, and then you train a neural network to reverse that process. If the neural network perfectly reverses that process, you can show mathematically that it cannot be creative. It must go from noise to one of the training set points, okay? So how can it be creative? The creativity of diffusion models must lie in their failure to perfectly reverse this diffusion process, but it must fail in intelligent and sensible ways. Okay, so that's what our theory explains. It explains how this can happen. So just to give you kind of what our theory does, imagine you have a trained diffusion model, for example, this UNet architecture. Oops, sorry. And we're only going to be looking at convolutional diffusion models for reasons I'll explain. So what this diffusion model does, or this UNet does, is it takes in a noise and iteratively it transforms it into a structured image. Okay, what does our theory do? Our theory will take as input the same noise realization and we'll feed it into this theory. The theory has access to the training data, but it doesn't train on the training data. It uses the training data as a database to search through, roughly. And what our theory does, it has a particular differential equation that takes the noise, takes the training data, and spits out a predicted image, a prediction of what the trained diffusion model will do. And this is schematic, but if the theory matches the experiment, the two images should be quite similar. What the theory actually does is it writes down an optimal equivariant local analytic theory because this UNet is not highly expressive. It has inductive biases corresponding to locality and equivariance, which Mason will explain. And this optimal local analytic theory is just a set of differential equations that requires no training. It requires some scale calibration, but other than that, it can predict the outputs of trained diffusion models. And so just to show you the theory works, here's examples for simple data sets, right? So for simple data sets, for a ResNet backbone or UNet backbone, each pair of images is an experimental image created by a trained diffusion model and the theoretical prediction from our theory. And you can see that there's a really nice match across all of these. And we can actually explain how these things are created. And the median R squared in pixel space between theory and experiment is around 0.9, depending on the architecture or the data set. So I realize this was super cryptic, but I hope this entices you to go to Mason's talk tomorrow. And he'll explain beautifully what's going on. Okay. So now let's go to reasoning. I think of reasoning as somehow dual to creativity. In creativity, it's an open-ended problem. You just want to create something interesting. Of course, the devil's in the details as to what is interesting to us. But mathematical reasoning is dual in the sense that there's a correct answer. You're solving a math problem. If it's a well-posed problem, there's a one answer. If you're trying to find a proof, the proof better be correct. There can be creativity in finding the proof, but at the end of the day, there's a correct answer. So how are AI systems getting better at reasoning these days, right? So they actually work. They're not just large language models anymore. They're interacting with other systems like proof-assistant verifiers and so forth. So the way it works at a high level is the following. Say in the context of mathematical theorem proving, you have a large language model on the left. And it's stochastically guessing in an autoregressive manner the next steps in a proof. It sends those next steps to a proof-assistant verifier, for example, a system using Lean, formal language for math. And it can check whether the theorem and all the steps in a proof so far are correct or not, are logically consistent. Okay, and if it is, it can return whether or not it's correct. If it's correct, it can guess the next step and keep going. If it's incorrect, it can backtrack, it could restart, all the types of things you imagine you have to do in reasoning, right? So ultimately, this turns out to be like a searching through a tree where one branch is the correct proof and the LLM is a guesser and the proof assistant is a checker, okay? So that's at a very high level how it works these days. There's a nice connection to the work of Kahneman. This is an analogy that people have posited, where we could think of the large language model as our system one, fast intuition, and the proof assistant verifier as our system two, deliberative, deductive thought. Okay. All right. So, and it turns out this works. So this opens up a new dimension of scaling, which is inference time compute via search. So a very simple way to use this loop is just keep going until you make a mistake, or you're invalid, then restart. And then, so you have this new axis, which is the number of times that you restart. And this is the performance on a certain math data set. And you can see that there's a scaling law for the more times you try your guesses, you do better, okay? So this is good, but are we doing the best thing possible at the moment? So it turns out there could be a potential misalignment between these two processes of learning via next token prediction to get the LLM versus search, which you use at inference time. Okay, so the learning is done via a single token prediction, but the inference is doing multiple guesses along a search tree, right? So there's a problem. Learning through maximum likelihood estimation or minimizing cross-entropy loss involves placing probability, as much probability as possible on the most likely next steps as indicated by your training data, right? This could be fantastic if you place the probability in the correct answer, but this could be disastrous if you place a lot of probability on wrong answers. And we've all sort of worked with colleagues who are confident and wrong, and it can be quite difficult sometimes to work with them. But it's also very difficult if your large language model is confident and wrong. Because if you allow it more and more time to guess, it won't do any better because it'll keep guessing wrong answers, right? On the other hand, if you have access to a lot of search, if you have access to a lot of search, then it might be that as you're learning, you'd like to hedge your bets and spread your probability across many next promising steps, right? So if you know ahead of time that when at test time you're going to be able to guess a lot, you might not want to concentrate all your probability mass on as directed by your training data. So learning can actually hurt search if learning and search are not aligned via co-design. We actually show evidence for that in this paper by Feng and Allen. And by the way, Feng will be presenting a poster on this today as well, so I encourage you to go to his poster to get much more details. So what happens? We can prove a theorem, okay, that learning and search must be co-designed, okay, and that theorem is basically under some given accuracy constraint on the LLM, and under the constraint of being allowed n guesses at test time, the optimal policy or the optimal LLM, if it's given a few guesses, the optimal guesser should confidently exploit, i.e. place all of its probability mass on what it thinks it's the best answer, and therefore have a low entropy guess distribution. On the other hand, if you're allowed many guesses during search, the optimal guesser should unconfidently explore and hedge its bets and place its probability mass across many possible outputs and have a high entropy guess distribution. And what we did is we discovered an efficient algorithm to modify next token prediction to choose the right amount of exploration for any amount of searches at test time. And we can show that this actually gets us better performance. And so this is one of our results. So there's a lot in this figure. So let me unpack it. So this n on the horizontal axis is the number of guesses allowed at test time. Okay? This is the performance or probability of correct on mathematical reasoning tasks. Okay? This red curve is a scaling law for what everyone would do if you train during learning using next cross entropy loss, right? And these different curves are our new learning algorithms for different values of n prime. So n prime is like the effective exploration that we're assuming we're going to have when we train the model. So n prime is a parameter in our training procedure. A high n prime means we encourage exploration. A low n prime means we don't encourage exploration. This black curve is the Pareto optimal performance at test time across all possible training procedures. And you can see that we do much better than using cross-entropy loss for learning. And you can see that to achieve the Pareto optimal, you have to match the n prime or exploration used in training or learning to the n that you would have using search. So if you have a lot of exploration, I'll stop there. So hopefully that makes sense, right? So let me summarize. So yeah, these are, again, if you're interested in more details, I tried to give the high-level overviews, but if you're interested in more details, you can find them all in these papers. There's a lot more work that we're doing, and if you're interested, this is probably like thematically very related to Kempner, is I gave a TED talk recently on thinking about like bridging biological and artificial intelligence better. And I think that the key questions that I focused on that my lab is also working on are thinking about like the order of magnitude discrepancy between AI and biology and data efficiency, AI and biology and energy efficiency, going beyond evolution to co-opt neural algorithms and implement them actually even in quantum hardware. We're trying to do better explainable AI and actually melding minds and machines through bidirectional communication between them. So if you're interested in kind of this broader, even higher level overview, you could check that out. Okay, I'll stop here. Thanks.
Congratulations on the work, and sorry about the tennis loss. In the first part of the talk, in the 2D model of the computation. There's an absolute value of the position of the mouse and position of the landmark.
Yeah.
Is that a spatial absolute value or
That's
a
a, that's a
temporal one?
spatial, yeah, that's a
Okay.
spatial absolute value.
Even in spatial, it just feels a little weird to me and
Yeah,
acausal. Could you talk about that a bit?
yeah, it's because of the following. We don't exactly know when the landmark exerts an influence on the mouse, right? So as the mouse is passing the landmark, it can start to exert an influence as it's approaching it. It can also exert an influence as it's leaving it, right? So we didn't try to model that. We just put an absolute value there. And that f function wasn't even learned. It was just a fixed function. The only, the overall scale, we kind of was a hyperparameter that we tuned. But yeah, the only things we learned was the pinning phase of the landmark.
Did you try running it with more of a heavy side? It just interests me a lot. So I'm wondering
Yeah,
what insights are there.
we could have tried that actually. Yeah, I'm not sure how much of a difference we could make, but we could in principle introduce a spatial shift in the peak of f as a function of its argument and ask how does performance degrade as that spatial shift departs from zero. Yeah.
So yeah, I heard your first
Oh, hey, Conrad.
piece as asking a mechanistic question, like how do the neurons do it?
Yeah.
But like in a way, if we look at behavior, now of course in our internal map, however it's represented, seeing a landmark moves us to this space. That's like a given based on the necessary normative criteria in this environment. So couldn't it be like the way I see it? There's a huge set of ways of how it could be mechanistically implemented.
Yeah.
You could have like the neurons and they're recurrently connected to other neurons. You could have the neurons and they connect to one another. You could have the neurons and something changes the neuromodulation in them.
Yeah.
So it seems that the results that you find, which is basically in the grid cell type, the right representation,
Yeah.
is compatible with any mechanistic model.
I mean, you could think of this as modeling at MAR level, algorithm level, or you could think of it as a phenomenological model. But the most mechanistic we got is, for example, in this PNS paper, where we use a conventional attractor network for grid cells driven by velocity. And then we have landmark cells coming in with synaptic connections, and we do Hebbian plasticity. And that enforces this consistency condition between where landmarks are and so forth. And that actually explains a lot of data. Could there be a completely different way to do it? Sure. We don't have a theorem, but this is a very simple, natural way to do it. I would say can't think of a simpler model that explains a set of behaviors that we see, both in terms of neurons and behavior of the mouse. Right? And then in this model, you could think of. Julian, let me just stop there.
Natural environments are often quite crowded with potentially many landmarks. And I was just wondering to what extent this might change the story. For example, if there's a transition between weak random pinning and strong pinning, do you have to choose which landmarks you do this for?
Yeah, so that's what I would, let's see where, sorry, keep going. Yeah, so we actually thought a lot about that. So in this PNS paper, so if you have multiple landmarks, right, then you have n choose 2 constraints that you have to implement, right? The pinning phase of landmark A, so I could see landmark A, then walk to landmark B, say this thing. This will have one pinning phase, this will have another pinning phase. The pinning phase of this landmark plus the phase advance due to motion better equal the pinning phase of that landmark in order to get a consistent map. And I have to solve n choose 2 constraints, right? So that was something that we were very puzzled about until we solved it in this PNS paper. And it's a super simple algorithm that solves this constraint. Just Hebbian learning from landmarks to the grid cell network will move the pinning phases around, and velocity will move the bumps around, and everything will become self-consistent. And we can prove that that happens. In the model, we can prove that happens.
One here and then in the back.
Thank you, Surya.
Okay.
So I have a question. So you think of this landscape that you have in your torus. that if you have a landmark, as if you have a pool in there, like you have a dip in there, right? So, to contrast like what Conrad was saying, so one way of finding out if there's actually a relation to causal mechanistic description of this, you can actually, you have a sequence of neurons which get activated, right? So you can actually like basically push this dip to pull away from actually the actual location of a landmark. And that can give you guys a way of like probing this to see like, is this a good description? Because when you can have a landmark, but basically move this dip by disrupting the information flow.
Right.
Have you done an experiment like that?
We did actually. I kind of skipped that details, but that's on this slide, right? So if you look at the three virtual reality environments there, you can see that we've shifted the landmarks to the right, and the grid cells get shifted to the right as well, right? And an even more powerful test of that is just our ability to predict the grid cell code in a new environment that consists of a random new permutation of familiar landmarks, right? So our simple model can actually predict it in the new environment. So this really shows that the pinning at a single location, but weak is sufficient to explain the data. We're not saying it's necessary. It could be something more complicated, but it's sufficient.
A question about on reasoning. So this is a hack, I think, that people use in practice where they change the temperature of the softmax distribution. Does the theory say anything about sort of doing that in a more principle?
Yeah, we didn't change the temperature. That would be a way to encourage exploration after you've already trained the model. I don't think it works well as encouraging exploration while you're training the model. And so that's what we did. And basically what we did is instead of maximizing the probability that the next token appears under one sample, we maximize the probability that the next token appears under n prime samples. That's literally the training algorithm. And you can make that efficient. And then if you match n prime at training time or learning time to n at test time, you achieve the Pareto optimal performance we can get. Hi, Zach.
How you doing, Surya? Beautiful stuff here. This first figure that you talked about, where you perturb things, does that suggest that if you have any landmark, they will always be pinning things in kind of initially in the same way? Like if I have a tree of this type, I got my cypress tree, it's always going to help pin the phase in that direction? Or can I have a different pinning from that cypress tree in different contexts?
It's a good question. In our model, all the landmarks were unique, so we never had the same visually similar landmark twice, right?
But these are shifted. So
they're shifted, yeah. Yeah, so what our model to explain this data is the pinning phase doesn't change if you shift the location, right? So there's a location of the landmark in physical space, and there's a pinning of the landmark in the torus space. If you shift the landmark, you're clearly shifting in physical space, but we're assuming the pinning phase of the landmark in the torus is the same, right? And that's, again, sufficient to explain the data.
And so that means that every time you see that cypress tree, it's always going to pin your phase in the same way.
Yes, but I suspect that there's going to be some generalization that the system has to decide to do. So this suggests actually a great experiment, which is modulate the visual similarity of the landmark in a 1D space. And as you change the similarity, does the pinning location change? And that's a great experiment, actually. We haven't done that.
Great. Well, thanks, Surya, again.